delay this. Today's talk, as you know, is titled Brown-Britain, Indian Art, Imperial Encounter and Diasporic Dreaming. We have with us Dr. Zehra Jumabhoy. The talk will investigate ideas of Britishness, Brown-ness, and colonial identity in the contemporary British art world. It will frame this discussion via research-led curatorial projects that the speaker has been involved with, and artists such as Yinka Shoniber, Rakib Shaw, and the Singh twins will feature in this talk. We know what exciting art, and you have it right on your screen, right? These artists are producing, and it's going to be a treat. I will introduce Dr. Zehra Jumabhoy, but after that, I will just take a brief break to introduce some of the programs that are upcoming at Jnanapravaha. But first, Dr. Jumabhoy. She's a lecturer in the history of art at the University of Bristol, UK. She is an art historian, curator, and writer, specializing in modern and contemporary South Asian art, including its connections with British past and present. Zehra was the Stephen and Elena Hines Scholar at the Curatorial Institute of Art, London, where she completed her doctorate and subsequently lectured on undergraduate and postgraduate programs between 2016 and 2020. She's been a visiting lecturer at various academic institutions in the UK, India, Pakistan, and Singapore. In 2018, she co-curated the landmark exhibition, The Progressive Revolution, a Modern Art for a New India, at New York's Asia Society Museum. Amongst other ventures, she is Curatorial Research Fellow at Glyn Vivian Museum in Swansea, a position funded by the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, which will culminate in the major exhibition Imperial Subjects, Post-Colonial Conversations between India and Wales in autumn 2024. Now, just a little about our upcoming programs. We've got two still to come, even though our academic year is almost at an end. On April 27th, from 6:30 to 8:30, JPM Jnanapravaha, along with Chemold Prescott Road Gallery, which is on the same floor, we're neighbors. We will present a lecture as part of our creative processes. That's one of the rubrics that we have. It's titled, the event is titled Sharjah Biennial 15, Thinking Historically in the Present, India at the Sharjah Biennial, situating 12 participating artists. An introduction on the premise of the Sharjah Biennial 15 will be first given by Ms. Shireen Gandhi, Director of Chemold Prescott Road. She will also present something on 9 of the participating artists. And of course, this will be followed by presentations by the artists themselves, the 3 artists who are in Mumbai, that is Anju Dodia, Prajakta Potnis, and Reena Kalat. So this will feature all the artists of the Indian artists in the Sharjah Biennial. I'm naming the artists here so that you know what we have in store. Amar Kanwar, Anju Dodia, Archana Hande, Lavanya Mani, Vithu Sen, Nelly Setna, Nilima Sheikh, Pablo Bartholomew, Prajakta Potnis, and Reena Kalat, of course, Varunika Saraf, and someone whom we've just lost, Vivan Sundaram. On May 1st, again, 6:30 to 8:30, Dr. Deborah Diamond and Dr. Dipti Khera, both in the US, will, so basically the event is at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Art. We are doing a virtual walkthrough of this exhibition with them. The exhibition is The Splendid Land. And of course, our talk is titled In the Mood, Exhibiting Udaipur's Paintings of Place. So this talk, like the exhibition, will reveal the environmental, political, and emotional contexts in which the new genre emerged, the new genre of painting at Udaipur emerged. It explores the unique visual strategies that artists developed at this time to communicate emotions, depict places, and celebrate water resources in Udaipur. With that, without any delay, because I'm honestly excited about this talk, Zehra, the floor is yours. Thank you for doing this for us.
Oh, that's so sweet. And sorry for driving you mad with technical issues last minute. So hi, everybody. And if I sound a bit flustered, very sorry. It's a Saturday morning and I am a little bit flustered. But I hope you'll enjoy the talk. And I certainly sort of also hope there'll be questions. If you do feel like interrupting me, actually feel free to do that. I don't know what Jnanapravaha rules are, but I quite like being interrupted usually in sort of class, and that's kind of how I'm treating this. So today, what I'm giving you is a little slice of some of the curatorial projects that I have upcoming, but it isn't actually to sort of plug them in any way. It's more a kind of a sort of working through some of the ideas behind these projects, and like larger ideas that I've been thinking about for the last few years on notions of Britishness, of nation, ideas of diaspora and displacement. We'll also get little bits on Kashmir, and this is somewhere where if you'd like to come in and say something, feel free to do that. But the framing of this talk is really investigative rather than me trying to tell you anything. I've got a little starter, which you might find a little bit contentious. In fact, I hope you do. So I had previously given a talk called Brown Britain, sort of subtitle was different, for Firoza Godrej and the Museum Society of Bombay. I thoroughly enjoyed my experience giving that talk. This isn't the talk that you're getting today. And one of the reasons for that is because it was a very lively discussion about how my whole characterization of Brown Britain, but in fact of the possible importance of in discussing an Indian diaspora in a British context. There was a general feeling among quite an illustrious Bombay audience that perhaps while it might be a burning question for me and other diasporic people lodged in Britain, was actually of no real excitement or relevance. So let me phrase it in a slightly different way. It was almost as if when I gave that talk a couple of years ago now, discussing ideas of Brown Britain, that the feeling was that Brown Britain or the diasporic Indian community and the artists were in some way part of a completely different dialogue, and that perhaps they were utterly irrelevant, is how one of the audience members put it, to an India that had moved on from any British imperial encounter or power, that the relationships between India and Britain are different now, and who really cares about the imperial past? And that sort of kind of jolted me a little bit, because I thought, actually, I'm really glad somebody said that. Of course, I also felt that this was a little disingenuous. And so this is one of the things that I'm kind of discussing today, is that, you know, while we might, in an Indian context, like to ignore an imperial past, in fact, whether it is, and in a British context, the imperial past sort of haunts all British dialogues, whether it's sort of admitted or otherwise. There's a sort of weird kind of amnesia on both sides that increasingly is becoming impossible to sustain. And I shall also show you why, not only through art, but also through a little bit of politics. So what you're seeing in front of you now is actually a work by the Singh twins called Rule Britannia. And it's not a work that's connected with any curatorial project I've done. It was actually a friend of mine, Emily Hannam, who is a curator at the British Museum, but she was at this point, she commissioned this work from the Singh twins for an exhibition that she had curated at the Royal Collection Trust for the Queen's Gallery. And I've just given it as a starting image because I want you to notice a few things within this. So it's actually a light box. It's a blown up version of the Pachanama, which is, as everyone knows, it's also often called the Windsor Pachanama because it's the a beautiful miniature manuscript that exists within the Windsor collection, the Queen's collection, and it was shown with Emily's show called Eastern Encounters. In some avatars, it was called Eastern Encounters, and so as a sort of riff on the Pachanama, the Singh twins were invited to create a work. So the whole kind of structure of the piece takes off on the structure of the Pachanama, but instead of having Shah Jahan here in the sort of the window sections, they've been replaced with British royalty, and here you can see Queen Elizabeth. I also want you to pay attention quite closely to this Britannia killing the tiger. So the figure of Britannia, Rule Britannia, is often associated with a lion, and India is often associated with the tiger. So I'll be coming back to this in a little while. You also have here the idea of Britannia. You can see her on the side sitting on her lion. And of course, there's a ship symbolizing, well, migration. There's also ideas of British identity, sort of spoofed in the middle here. And now I'm sort of carrying on to my next slide, I hope. Okay. So this is an exhibition that I worked on, guest curated for Singapore, for an organization called the Institutum. So that's Andreas Tio's Institutum. And what we did was that Yinka Shonneberry was asked to make a work especially for the old Parliament House. So I just sort of flag it up as one of the projects that really got me thinking about ideas of diaspora, in this case, ideas of diaspora and Blackness, but resituating it within a colonial context and being deliberately disruptive. So this room, which was the old Parliament House, was where Singapore independence was sort of negotiated. It was also, it used to be the old imperial house where disputes to do with trade were negotiated. Singapore's parliament was held here, and the figure that Yinka Shonneberry, who is a Black British artist, actually created for this space is Lady Justice. And Lady Justice came from the Old Bailey, which is the Royal Courts of Justice in London, so very prominent building, and she stands with her sword and the sort of the balancer. I think I'm nervous because I've just forgotten that word. In her hands on the top of the Old Bailey. And Yinka Shonneberry recreates this figure and puts it in Old Parliament House, also sort of clad in his signature Dutch wax fabric, except in this case it's adjusted for a sort of local conversation within Singapore, and so she's partially covered in Vlisco, which is sort of a Dutch wax fabric, talking about the sort of ideas of African identity, but also the inauthentic nature of identity, how dependent it is on trade, which is the history of that Dutch wax fabric, which was used in the 70s for a lot of sort of African independence movements. But in actual fact, while it's sort of identified as an authentic African fabric, there's actually nothing authentic about that fabric at all. In fact, Yinka Shonibari finds it in and starts using it in South London. And it's a fabric that initially was made by the Dutch, having been inspired by Javanese batik. And they have a sort of during the sort of period of the Dutch East India Company, and they make this fabric and they try and sell it back to the Javanese and the Indonesians who don't want it. And so in the end, the people who do want it are their various African colonies, and it then becomes identified with a sort of authentic African fabric. So in a kind of way, Yinka Shonibari was sort of combining that fabric alongside batik motifs. So the lady's hands and arms are covered in a pattern called udong liris, which is the sort of diagonal pattern of the Javanese courts, whereas her dress, which is pink, is vlisco. And of course, we've got both vlisco as well as batik covering the seats in Parliament House. So this was one of the sort of things that got me thinking about, ideas of how the British Empire continues to live on or not live on in the colonies. Singapore, of course, is one of the few nations in the world, probably, that quite likes its British colonial heritage, perhaps because it Raffles is sort of identified as a founder member of Singapore. So it's a much more complicated space when it comes to negotiating that sort of British colonial identity. So that was sort of less a brown Britain and more a black Britain, but it did come into conversations about Asianness and empire. And this, in a way, sort of also kickstarted another series of projects which I've been doing with Katie Freer, who's head of exhibitions at the Glenvivian Museum in Swansea. Now, the Imperial Subjects Project, we've been trying, by the way, really hard to change this name, except that every time we give it something new, everybody keeps saying, oh, you mean imperial subjects. So where there's sort of stasis point where we're just calling it imperial subjects for the moment. It's a whole host of projects. It's actually started as us, Katie and me, trying to put together one exhibition that sort of connected India and Wales. We then got funding for it, and it became a series of seminars, which I'll show you a little bit about. And from that sort of spiraled into us collaborating on various other exhibitions that also involved India and Wales, and like really negotiating that dialogue. And finally, our exhibition connected to this is going to be in 2024, that's next year. And we're still debating what it could be called, but I really like, you can tell me what you think, Tigers and Dragons, for a specific reason that hopefully you shall find out why in a little bit. So here we've actually got a little slide from Richard Glenvivian. So the museum itself was started, and the main patron of that museum was someone called Richard Glenvivian, and the Glenvivian family were very famous for the copper works in Swansea. And Richard Glenvivian was the son who loved traveling, and so he's got these rather extensive travel diaries, which is also going to be sort of molded into part of our show. What you've got in front of you here is him visiting Lahore, so that's the Lahore Gate. So And you can see that I've given you a little slide from all the various sort of little talks that we had as a sort of connection with this project, tracing connection points between Welshness and India. And what's becoming really sort of obvious in our conversations is that, even if one thinks in terms of a British identity as a static entity, and as a sort of, as the British Empire, as something that is monolithic, in point of fact, Britain itself is no longer a monolithic entity, if it ever was. And the places like Scotland, Wales, Ireland have a very different inroad into ideas of Britishness, into where they see themselves. And I found, sort of, because I live in Wales, that actually there's quite a lot of synergy between the way the Welsh sort of see themselves as, and characterize themselves increasingly, quite a contentious dialogue, again, as England's colony, that sort of has particular kinds of when you look at the idea of the British Empire and the Welsh involvement in that, it throws up certain questions as to what was that involvement. Were they equal parties in the dialogue of, if they were not equal parties in the dialogue of Britishness, then does that mean that, as a nation, Wales is less culpable for empire? What exactly is that connection in the first place? But also, for me, what's really interesting is, tracking certain movements within India as a result of a particular kind of organic nationalism, and seeing so many of the similar dialogues with early Indian independence being mirrored as to the kind of things that are being said in Wales, as it sort of negotiates a more devolved government from the rest of Britain, and it sees itself as increasingly, and sometimes contentiously, as as England's colony. So here are some of the projects that I mentioned, and this is the still to be agreed upon title, Tigers and Dragons, Conversations Between India and Wales. And of course, the reason for tigers is because very often sort of Indian identity has been associated with, well, Tipu's tiger in the Powys collections, for instance. Powys Castle, which is in Wales, has a huge collection from Clive of India, but also has a huge collection from his daughter-in-law, Henrietta Clive. So all the Tipu works are sitting there. So tigers quite important in terms of British characterizations of Indian identity. And of course, the dragon is the Welsh dragon. So here are some of the projects that we did. And one of the ones that I actually want to talk about, because it's something that I want to sort of investigate for the show, and what I found really interesting in the last year, where I've been a lecturer at the University of Bristol, and I've just put together my own course called Art and Empire. And I just wanted to test it out. So the first day of the course, I asked my students, who is Robert Clive? And one of the reasons that I thought very important to ask them this is because there'd been a lot of stuff in the newspaper about the Clive statue in Whitehall. You ask any Indian person or Pakistani person, who is Robert Clive? And immediately they would take it for granted that everybody knows this. Not one of my very sort of, not one of my students actually knew who Robert Clive was. And then finally somebody piped up and said, is he a bad person? Is that why they're trying to take him down? Does he have something to do with slavery? And so it then followed into a very long history lecture, which they were not expecting, on who is Robert Clive. But this is just to flag up to you that if there's a kind of amnesia with within India of saying, you know, and Pakistan as well, saying the colonial past is somehow irrelevant to us right now. There's a similar kind of amnesia that about the British Empire, and which is not taught in schools, and particularly not taught is the Indian encounter. So this is obviously Robert Clive, and we all know this, the Battle of Plassey, 1757. And the reason that I'm showing it here is that both of these artworks, this one, by the way, you can see in the initial image that I sent you, it's hiding inside there. There you have it. You have Robert Clive hiding there. So, and this image as well of Robert Clive negotiating the treaty with Shah Alam, both of these works are at Powys Castle in Wales, which has it has the sort of most, one of the most extensive collections of Indian artifacts and India-related material. And this is also because there are two waves of it. One is Robert Clive himself, who buys the Herbert's estates, and then his son, Edward Clive, who is involved in the Mysore Wars. His wife, Henrietta Clive, goes on what could only be described as a shopping spree, though people have shouted at me for saying this before, in the wake of the Tipu losing the war, and buys up large quantities of his estate. Buys, you know, it's not a gift, and it's not loot. She does buy it, but you know, that opens another question for us possibly to investigate, is the idea that if you're buying something if you're buying something when your husband has just helped to defeat a ruler, and you know, you're going and picking up these things and bringing them back to Powys Castle, you know, what does that say about that particular nature of ownership? And there's a lot of conversations going on in Britain at the moment about restitution. Where should these things be sent back? Should they be sent back? There's even conversations about whether or not these things should be sold because they belong to British history. So for me, it's a kind of a strange conversation to be having. It's that you get something and you buy it, but you buy it from a position of power, and then now suddenly it's a British history that is sitting in British collections that are not necessarily fully seen even. So Powys Castle is one of those that Katie and I are really interested in seeing if we can borrow works from, but also what we want to do is not just look at Robert Clive as, you know, part of the East India Company, and part of a sort of a kind of obvious British imperial dialogue. We also want to look at the fact that he basically buys property in Wales. And you find that with a lot of East India Company officials, many of whom are Scottish, who will not go back to won't go back to Scotland, and certainly might have houses in London. But if they're particularly contentious figures, as Robert Clive certainly was, then the easiest thing to do was to, you know, set up in high glory, far away from the center. So what did you do? You bought your way into the aristocracy in Wales. So that's one sort of dialogue which makes it kind of tricky to negotiate where Welshness fits into this larger imperial dialogue. The other thing that sort of came out of this is that as Kate and I started sort of doing investigations, and then we got the Paul Mellon Foundation money to make it a bigger project and to hire me as a curatorial fellow. We've also done other sort of connections between India and Wales that actually look at the sort of industry. And so I was quite interested with tracing how Bombay's textile mills and the sort of dying of those mills actually map onto Welsh identity politics, to do with the fact that, you know, Thatcher in the 80s shuts the coal mines in Wales, and it's something that South Wales certainly has never really recovered from. So you still have the valleys where there's a limit as to the jobs. So industrial Wales has sort of died and there's nothing to replace it. You can hardly say that about Bombay or Mumbai, whichever you want to call it. But in a Welsh context, it's never sort of moved on from the dying of that industry. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to sort of do a compare and contrast. Also, especially interesting, not just to trace the sort of imperial trade links, but also to look at the fact that perhaps the tables have totally turned, because as I said, South Wales, you know, with the shutting of the coal mines, doesn't really have a huge amount of industry anymore. However, the one that it does have is the steel factory, which is owned by Tatas. So I'm coming to that very shortly, but a few of the things that, you know, when people said this is an irrelevant dialogue for Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis to talk about, you know, the diaspora, to talk about imperial identity as a, you know, everybody has moved on other than diasporic communities that are still sort of lodged within Britain. And I want to kind of ask you, how irrelevant is it really? So one of the imperial subjects, potential relevance, is the crown jewels, which were on Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral. And so there you can see the Kohinoor being proudly carried along on the coffin. And as everybody here probably knows, there was also like lots of screaming in the Indian press. It certainly was all over Instagram as to, you know, perhaps the Kohinoor should be given back. And you then have, so I want to take you back to where it was somewhat less contested, that it belonged on the crown. So here was during the heyday, or almost heyday, not quite heyday by this point, of rule Britannia, and Queen Mary, who absolutely adored her India connections, particularly the jewel, which was set in the crown. And here you can see, I grabbed it off the net. It's sitting proudly and relatively uncontestedly, saying, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves." Does it really? So now, very, very big contrast. Here you have it on here. You have it sort of carrying on along in endless tradition, supposedly, from Queen Mary to Queen Elizabeth. And then you now have Camilla announcing, or Queen Camilla announcing that there'll be no Kohinoor for her. So she will not wear this crown during the coronation. So that in itself is rather interesting. And I wonder why, because it's very contentious, right? But also, perhaps a new power dialogue is setting up. So what, here you have Rishi Sunak and Modi sort of, with Rishi Sunak sort of negotiating for trade relations, I guess, in this particular image. And as I said, the tables have turned a little bit. So you have Tata Steel owning the steelworks in Port Albert, and every year there's a sort of rush of news on Wales Online that talks about the fact that perhaps Tata Steel will shut the steelworks, in which case there would be a real issue. It's the last of industrial Wales in operation, and there would be quite a lot of jobs lost. And so there's a constant fear of that. And also one of the things that made Katie and me want to investigate these sort of connections between art and industry in Wales and also in India. And you can see sort of some of the proceeds of that on a website that we did with the Science Museum in Bangalore with Janvi Falke, and it's actually on her website. There's a link, but also on the Glenvivian one and also on my website. And it's quite an involved project, actually. So here are a few reasons why perhaps this dialogue is not so irrelevant. So one of them is partition. So if we're looking at the sort of continuing legacy of partition within the Indian subcontinent, which is something that obviously, because I'm very interested in nationalism per se, is something that I do look at quite a lot in my own research. We're also today looking at a different kind of partition. What partition would that be? So quite a few memes that came came onto my Insta page and other things that I thought I would give you. So it says, India versus Pakistan, Rishi Sunak's refusal for Hamza Yusuf's independence call sparks a meme fest on Twitter. So this was one of the comments on the meme fest that went absolutely viral. A Hindu and a Muslim are discussing the partition of Britain. So a few little things about, potential connections and also the explanation of my drive for tigers and dragons as the title of the exhibition. So rename imperial subjects into tigers and dragons. So some of the dialogues that are quite prominent here in Wales, England's colony. And here is the famous Edward Armitage work called Retribution. It was made in 1858, just after the First Indian War of Independence. I know it's very contentious to call it that, but that's what I'm calling it. And you can see that the Singh twins have also done another riff on it. And this is, you can see it right at the bottom over here, Britannia killing the tiger. So here it's the tiger of Bengal, but often it's also the Tipu tiger. So in a lot of kind of imperialist British paintings, the tiger becomes a cipher for India, whether it's the Bengal tiger or whether it's the Tipu tiger that is defeated and sat on by the lion of Britannia, or sometimes it's just a very muscly Britannia killing the tiger. Okay, so the last bit is actually, I'm going to be giving you a little sneak preview of an exhibition that I've been working on, which is going to be opening in September as the guest curator. So the first place that the exhibition will go will be the Frist Art Museum in Nashville. And then the second place that it will go, and it's a sort of joint project between the two museums, is the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston. And it's Rakib Shaw's US traveling show, which is called The Ballads of East and West. I just wanted to also flag up that my interest in Rakib sort of started from here. So this is an installation view of Rakib's work in Manchester at the Whitworth. And it was it was curated by Maria Bolshaw. It's a very, very intriguing display. So it's got his paintings, but they were put alongside their inspiration and also juxtaposed against the wallpaper, which is incredibly ornate, and it's actually Rakib's own wallpaper. So he makes it partially inspired by William Morris's wallpaper patterns. But also, I think it's called Midsummer Night's Dream. So you can see a tiny little blue puck from Midsummer Night's Dream looking quite evil and sort of squiggling around in the patterning of the wallpaper. I won't really dwell on what he might or might not be doing there, that puck. Other than making slightly facetious comments about that, what really kind of intrigued me was the level of sort of cross-cultural embeddedness that Rakib's work actually has. And I'm going to look at one image, and this is a little bit of where Kashmir sort of comes in terms of this particular work that was hanging, as you can see, on this wall. So let's look at the sort of symbolism of this work. So here you have Rakib dressed. It's a riff on. He doesn't like the word riff, but it's sort of send up. It sort of references a Northern Renaissance artist called Jean Gossard. That in itself is really quite interesting, that Rakib's work does reference the Italian Renaissance, but he also quite unusually draws on the Northern Ren quite a lot. And so here you have him as in blue, like the Virgin Mary, and in his hands, the original painting, by the way, is called the Adoration of the Virgin. And here you have little wolf-faced men, quite wicked-looking ones, richly garbed, and they are offering the Rakib as Virgin Mary with Christ in his arms, except that it's his doggy, Mr. C. And they are offering him all kinds of gifts. He's surrounded by fruit that is rotting. So it's also a vanitas painting, vanitas vanitatum, this too shall pass. The idea that wealth and riches and material reality is painting. And so the gifts that they're offering him are somewhat tainted perhaps with the fact that you almost get the sense that these rather scary looking men are offering him and bribing him with something. So I wonder what it is that they're sort of trying to bribe him for. They're sort of trying to tempt him. They're tempting him with a Mughal water sprinkler. And in the background, he's got an image of the Hariprabhat fort and Kashmir. Also surrounding him are, well, other than the dangling skeletons, are also parakeets, which Rakib has said before sort of reminds him of the parakeets he used to keep as pets as a child when he was in Kashmir. So his sort of childhood Kashmiri past. And here again is a kind of Mughal past that is being referenced in the very thing that the sort of richly garbed wolfmen, hybrid wolfmen, are offering him. Perhaps one of the things that one could say about this is and something that he has sort of flagged up in interviews, is that it's one of a series of works that talks about his relationship to the British art world, and perhaps the art world, the nasties, as he's termed them in one of his interviews, was he's also called them art world nasties. So, in some sense, perhaps it's a seduction, or it's a potential seduction into the sort of upper echelons of the British establishment. Maria Bolshaw, who curates this show at the Whitworth, is also a now director of date. So it's an establishment insertion for Rakib in this way. But at the same time, you can see that he's refusing to be bribed, perhaps. And in the background is this juxtaposition of something that is about displacement, is about a world that doesn't exist for him anymore, and that is Kashmir itself in the background. So this is kind of what got me. I mean, I've always loved Rakib's work, but this is kind of what got me really wanting to make friends with him and see if we could, eventually we decided to do something together. And what then resulted is Ballads of East and West, Rakib Shaw's American journey. And as I said, it will start off at the Frist Art Museum and then carry on to Isabella Gardner in Boston next year. And then it's traveling onwards from that. It's going to the Museum of Fine Art in Houston. And then it's sort of ending its tour at the Huntington. So this is one of the works that was selected for it. I'm going to go much more quickly now because I just want to sort of get to some of the, just a few sort of highlight that I kind of want to focus on the idea of negotiating between East and West, as it were, but also negotiating the idea of diaspora, its continued relevance to dialogues today about national identity. And it's not just about being slightly facetious about the fact that, Britain has to deal with its past and who counts as Britain in the first place. For me, sitting in Wales is like, what was the Welsh encounter? That we're sort of looking at, what are the repercussions? But also the fact is that, how to put this in a non-contentious way, perhaps there isn't one. The fallout of partition and of the Radcliffe lines is still with us today. It's still with us in the way Kashmiri identity is or is not being negotiated. It's still with us in the fact that for many, there's a syncretic Kashmir that no longer exists. It's no longer possible for them. Here you have Rakib sitting, much like Saint Jerome. So it's another Renaissance painting by Catena this time. And he's called it Kashmir version. And there he is sitting like Saint Jerome, who is the sort of, Saint Jerome is a saint that was very important for the Vulcan Bible. So he's a great translator, which in itself tells you quite a lot as to why Rakib might identify with him. He's also known for his austerity, chastity, and for being a great connector between East and West. So I thought this was quite a good image. As you see here, he's sitting totally oblivious to the luxuries all around him, some of which are being gobbled up by mice. And in the background, you have his own work, his own things, carpet, and also a little vista of a Sufi shrine in flames from the what could be a window looking out. And you have juxtaposed with this sort of the Dal Lake and the Himalayas in the distance. And all of these worlds, the world of the studio, the world of painting itself, the famous sort of Catena painting, as well as Rakib's paintings, which are also included and inserted. This is the mild-eyed, what is it called? The mild-eyed melancholy of the lotus eaters that you can see embedded on top. So it's a frame within a frame of artworks embedded within artworks. And it's a sort of slippage through the windows of what's real, what's fantasy, and what's actually a diasporic dream, perhaps. This is the reference point image. And here you can see St. Jerome. And you can also see how cleverly that's actually being done with what could be a Kashmiri houseboat This is a very sort of elaborate Kashmiri houseboat. It's a hotel, in the cedarwood paneling, which when I saw it on one of the sort of images, I was like, oh, wow, actually, it makes a really good image comparison with the paneling here in the central portion of Rakib's work. So it's a sort of very quotational rich work. And so I'm not going to really focus on this. I'm going to focus on a few images that we chose for the show that also sort of contain works within works. And perhaps what really fascinates me and why I'm bringing them up in this context, it's as it references works within works. There's also a dialogue, not just with art history, with how does an artist like Rakib, a British artist, in a way, Kashmiri British artist, a British Indian artist, however, just an artist. How do you sort of, how is he placed within a larger art historical trajectory? Which trajectory do we as readers or as viewers place him? But also, which trajectory does he place himself in? And it's this very sort of self-conscious placing that really intrigues me about his work. So it's kind of like, there's certain writers who are writers for writers, and it almost feels like Rakib Shaw is an artist for art historians, because he is an art historian even in the way he sort of constructs his dialogue. So one of the works that is sort of being given a sort of core place within this Ballads of East and West is a work called The Retrospective. So even though the show itself is not a retrospective, right, not even a mid-career retrospective, it's a relatively small show. At the most, it has 20 works as it travels. It contains a retrospective at its core. And this is Rakib standing in Venice, which is the first place that the retrospective painting was viewed. And here you can see the adoration embedded within it, and all of his other works as well. So some of the concepts that I wanted to talk to you about. And here I'm just going to give you a little explanation and then just move on and start winding up about why the name East and West. So this was a name that, I did not come up with it. It was very much Rakib came up with, this is what he wanted it to be called. So the concept for the Ballad of East and West emerges from the interstices of cultural interaction. Rudyard Kipling is usually characterized as a poet of empire, right? Proclaiming of the East and West that never the twain shall meet. Very contentious poet of empire these days. Many a book has been written about why we should not read Rudyard Kipling. Yet, this interpretation misunderstands the point of the poet's famous ballad, which actually proposes the exact opposite. But there is neither East nor West, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. So, quite interesting, two strong men, but whatever, it is subversive in a particular way. This traveling show will involve many a conversation, therefore, between cultures, creeds, and beliefs between the Kashmiri Rakib Shaw and the hybrid histories of the museums involved in the American voyage. This traces the main themes of his oeuvre with a series of new and old works, many of which have never been exhibited in public before, and almost all of which are filled with self-reflections. So here you can see Rakib reflecting on himself. One Rakib is reading the last rites to another Rakib within a coffin. And at the back is the Sancharya temple. And it's another reference to a Renaissance work. Okay, so a little bit of information about the temple itself, and the particular references that he makes within his images to a very syncretic Kashmir. His own childhood was such that he talks about, having Hindu gurus as teachers, going to a Christian school. He himself characterizes himself as a Sufi, making art in silence. And in fact, his studio itself, which is in Peckham, is almost a sort of, it used to be a sausage factory, so it's a converted sausage factory. It's huge, but you step inside it and you've entered a completely different world. So it's full of bonsai. It's got 4 gardens almost, and when I first went in there, it was sort of the one part of the landscape was being created, and he said it will be like a slice of the Himalayas. So it's a sort of recreated paradise, as it were, that doesn't exist in reality, except that it does exist in reality because it exists in his studio. And then it finds its way from the studio and from memory into his works themselves. So this is kind of my sort of little roundup now, is to tell you that this is not a retrospective. It's not a retrospective if we look at the idea of a retrospective as a chronology. If you look at the idea of retrospective as something with moments that build up into a linear pattern. So the retrospective at the core is about, in some ways, disrupting that kind of linearity, where the past falls into the present, falls backwards into the past. So it plays with the idea of time. Shaw lives in a recreated paradisical garden in London's Peckham, in what was once a sprawling sausage factory, which reimagines a Kashmiri paradise. Shaw is then both aesthetically and literally immersed in the paradoxical pools of culture, history, land, and belonging. In his paintings, Kashmir is evoked, erased. We see it as a mirror of the artist's past and as a vehicle for Proustian memory, i.e. non-linear, disruptive memory. An increasingly distant land, the past is another country. And this is the retrospective. As you can see, it is filled, the sort of self-curated retrospective, right? A vision possibly of his own studio, possibly. And these are some of his works. His tiny little Adam over here, a jewel encrusted sculpture, which is making its way across America. Here are some other works. So this show, many of the works chosen for this show actually will feel like they've fallen straight out of the retrospective, i.e. the retrospective that is Rakib's painted retrospective. And here again, you can see a sort of game with time, as it were, the retrospective 2002 to 2022. So that's the retrospective he has curated for himself, but the work itself is then made at a slightly different time, 2015 to 2022. And here you can see Rakib himself. Right at the center, in the backdrop, you can see a view of the Himalayas, of Kashmir burning at the bottom. And this is, and you can see you can see the adoration over here. You can see seeking Sarmag over here with and these are all works which will be in the show. No, this is Seeking Sarmag with the and this is a work that I really love. It's at the Met, and hopefully we will get it. It's called Ode to the Valley of Wonderment, and you can really sort of see sort of this twilight, this sort of midnight moon-filled landscape. And I also wanted to point out here, this is probably the last image I actually wanted to look at. You can see here a real sort of confluence of East and West, of different worlds as they collide, the world of studio as well as the world of of fantasy and myth. Right on the side here, you have something that pops out. And this is in fact the Venus Grotto. The Venus Grotto is something that was a fabrication by King Ludwig of Bavaria. He has often been judged by history as the mad King Ludwig of Bavaria. Most of you might know of Ludwig II through the amazing Visconti film that was made about him. Anyway, so Ludwig is very obsessed with Wagner, just like Rakib, and really obsessed with sort of ideas of himself as the Moon King. So Ludwig of Bavaria is very anti-Prussia, and affiliates with King Louis XIV, the Sun King, long dead, of course, by this point. And he sees himself as a reflection of the Sun King's glory, but he knows he will never be the Sun King. So instead, he sort of recreates Versailles in kind of miniature form, and he sort of creates these fantasy sort of lands within his palaces. And in fact, the Disney palace that you can sort of see in the Disney iconography is also a sort of riff. It's taken from one of Ludwig's palaces, the Swan Palace. So the swan is very important as well because of the swan cycle. And and the Swan Knight in Wagner to Ludwig, and these are sort of the references that you see on this side of the work. You also have, of course, the cherry blossoms, which function both ways. They talk about sort of Japan's idea of cherry blossoms, but also cherry blossoms was something that Rakib identifies with his Kashmiri childhood. And then I mean, I could do this for every single little bit of the painting, which is what is so amazing about Rakib's work, is each work yields references to myriad other works and artwork. So I will sort of stop here and just leave it with this idea of the notion of diasporic dreaming, the notion of the continuing consequences of the Radcliffe line, of the way in which the subcontinent is partitioned, the fact that here you have in London an artist sitting in a studio that looks like Kashmir, sort of is a melting pot of different kinds of cultures, tells you that perhaps it's not quite fair to talk about irrelevance, because nothing could be more relevant in this particular dialogue of what are the consequences of an imperial past. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Do you want me to stop sharing? Oh, Rashmi, I can't hear you. Everybody's on mute.
Unmute. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. No, I know. It was, sort of bringing me back. I went and saw Ludwig's fancy grottos, by the way. One of my trips to Bavaria, I saw them all, and it was literally, I can understand why he was called Mad Ludwig II. Because it's truly a fantasy, truly something that he spent a lot of money and actually got himself, got all the monies, I mean, the entire treasury emptied because of that. There's nothing left because of what he spent.
Yeah. And so, but then what really also fascinated me about, this Rakib's characterization of himself as Saint Jerome, for instance, the kind of reclusive Saint Jerome, and weirdly, like, Hiran Kimsi, which was one of Ludwig's palaces, which is not even finished because he runs out of money. And it's so lavish, the bits that are finished, complete with a dumb waiter that goes to his room so he doesn't have to see anything ugly at all. But then, if you actually go to Hiran Kimsi, you realize that he never lived in that palace. He lived like a little recluse in the little monk's cell on that land. But so you almost thought, that's really strange. Like, you built all of this, you bankrupted yourself, you've actually been declared mad because you bankrupted the state.
Correct.
And yet it's something that you're building as a fantasy idea of power that you're not inhabiting. And I wonder if there's, that whole connection with Saint Jerome, there's a sort of, there's another reason as to why Rakib with his own fantasy land kind of identifies with that.
Yeah, sure. Rakib's sort of, it's so layered, like you said, and it'd be wonderful to be able to see the paintings in the flesh at some point and actually see the various levels of it, just try and unpack it bit by bit, because there is so much. And I am quite astonished that somebody should have said that it's irrelevant. I mean, I'm really astonished.
Yeah, I even had a quote as to who it was. But then I thought,
there's no need to get into that. But but it just shows what a poor historian this person is. Doesn't understand the relevance of history first, doesn't understand the fallout of history, doesn't understand what has happened, what a rupture it was, and continues to be so. To say it's irrelevant is just crazy. And and yes, I can understand them saying it's irrelevant because there's no such thing as empire anymore. But nothing in history is irrelevant. Nothing. It just it continues in different ways and works out in different ways. But I'm glad you've done it in this way by bringing in Rakib's work and that sense of hyphenated identity, the sense of loss, the sense of non-belonging, because he'll never really belong anywhere. There will be a part of him which never belong, but yet there is that attempt to belong. You create your own paradise. You create your own charbagh in your studio, and then you try and inhabit it your own way. It's never an identical creation. It's your vision of that. That's what an artist does anyway. I think that was and the artist is always referencing his own life, always. It's always references to his own, to his losses, to his to what has moved him, to what has influenced him, even though people hate to use the word influence, but nevertheless, there is what you read, what you grow up with, what you see in your adolescence sometimes, because it just stays with you. So that was quite astonishing, and I'm glad you brought in Porville's Castle. There's much said about that. And I'd like to see where that initiative is going, which you all have started. Love to see where that goes, art and industry, and all the connections that would be made. Are you keeping it only with Wales and India, or are you looking at it as?
It started bigger than that, but then I think in order to sort of, there's so much to actually unpack in the Welsh dialogue, and so few of those things have actually been seen, even within Wales, because it's really difficult to borrow historical works, which it oughtn't to be within Wales, but it is. So we just thought that actually it would be a better, more sophisticated show if we kept it small as a show.
I think so also, because then it's more pointed, and it's a part of Great Britain that's very little, that's really been not looked into. I mean, honestly don't. Ireland, one has managed to sort of, look at Ireland, the institutions in Ireland are quite formidable on their own.
Yeah, and Scotland, which has so much, like it's dominating the dialogue.
Absolutely. But Wales is so I'm very happy that you've got this very pointed kind of a dialogue between Wales and India. Though, I worry about the tiger becoming becoming devouring, because it's so big. It's so big. It's such a large animal. It's so big. And so the chances of
the lion doesn't stand a chance. Yeah, no, but also it is that's actually that's a very clever comment, because as we're putting together the show, like we realize that we need more Welsh artists. Because everybody I suggest is like Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, like, and and Katie is like, yes, but also Welsh artists, also Welsh artists, and there are actually really, really good contemporary Welsh artists who've had very limited exposure.
Exactly. They're unknown, literally unknown, at least in our part of the world here.
Even within Britain, they're totally, it's just a written out dialogue. And in fact, it looks much more similar. Like when we did the art and industry thing, mostly we focused on the exhibition part of it, focused only on the Glyn Vivian's collection of industrial paintings. And so the workshops and the talks connected to that sort of made connections between Welsh industrial paintings and people like Sudhir Patwardhan talking about the sort of textile mills. And there's a huge synergy actually in making the sort of those kind of realistic paintings, which were very much there in Wales, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when that kind of painting and the figurative works were not fashionable within a larger scene, and yet that's what was being made. And so there's synergy with that and our kind of works in India, with the Sudhir Patwardhan, with our sort of magic realism, and the artists from Kerala, even someone like Jitish. There's so much more synergy with this bit of Welsh art history than there is with wider sort of more abstract dialogues.
True, absolutely. No, and it's always wonderful to sort of learn about a region that is been largely ignored, But I don't know if anybody is putting out any questions. I don't see any.
Which is very sad. Please put out some questions.
I know, it's very sad.
Jaya has got something?
Yes, there's a question here. Just
can't hear you, Jaya.
Good evening, it's Dr. Zehra. Just like a comment, the paintings appear magical with a Islam. And it looks like a mosaic painting. You see mosaic churches in Europe, something like that. In magical. Just a comment.
Yeah, no, totally. And the rakibs, right? And the way he kind of constructs them are they're almost jewel-like. He uses
rhinestones.
Well, now he says he doesn't use so many, he doesn't use rhinestones, the latest works, but some of them are actually jewels, like small Adam has got black diamonds in there, and sapphires, which he once said it represents the loot of Kashmir. But the kind of the enameling work, so he uses enamel, but it's filled in with almost like a stained glass window effect with the gold. So it's like just the technique of that painting itself is a sort of undercutting of traditional oils.
Yeah, it also reminds you of some of the paintings of what you see again in Memling and all of that, because again all those early Flemish artists were also were also, interestingly, they were enamel workers. And so the technique of painting is like they were layering enamel, that they were creating enamel, like, and so the polish and stuff and all of that on those paintings is of that quality. So this, you can see that with Rakib trying to, he's probably also looked at a lot of those early Flemish.
So he had this very interesting comment about a Crivelli work, which is sort of a takeoff on Crivelli, which is called I think it's called the Enunciation. And he talks about the fact that he finds it at the National Gallery, and it's the one painting that really challenges him, because the surfaces are so ornate, and so it's almost like, so he recreates it but in his own form, and is even more embellished with what he calls his new painting technique, and that's kind of like one of the centerpieces of this show, and it's like, it's an OTT work that he's taken even more OTT, so it's like, really a kind of battle between the masters, and I think there's no doubt in his mind that he's won that.
Yeah. I can sort of, it'd be interesting.
So there's a question from Surela. Surela, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the beautiful lecture. And I want to ask, there's a point where you mentioned about industrialism and art, how you trying to bring it together. And in Mumbai, you were able to factories, the textile factories, and you're talking about art as well. So how do you bring it together? Like, what is the idea behind it?
Okay, I could only hear a bit of it. Did you say something to do with textile factories and art?
Yes. Yeah. You just showed the picture of Mumbai's textile factory. And also
Surela, we can't hear you clearly. Do you want to type in your question?
Okay, sure.
Thank you. So I think it's fascinating. I think, it's like Dr. Podar pointed out, he's looking at older works, and it's almost as if some the miniature, which we should not be calling miniatures, have been expanded to an enormous degree, and I think you're overwhelmed by the detail. And maybe that also reflects in some ways our identities are just as layered, right? When you've been through colonization, and then you also have the fact of immigration. There are so many layers and so many layers. I think his work reflects that beautifully in the way it's done.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's also like something I've been thinking about a lot, mainly because last week I was sort of teaching diasporic art and looking at sort of Homi Bhabha's theories and things to do with migratory identity, fluid identity, all of these things that I usually use to describe diasporic artists. And Homi Bhabha himself has written on Rakib, he's written on interviewed Shazia Sikandar, or all of this, and that idea of a fluid identity. But what also kind of occurred to me is that when Homi talks about it, like he talks about it as a kind of a liberational fact that to make these colonial references undercuts the power of it. But in retrospect, and having worked with some of these artists in different forms, one is aware that yes, there's a liberational aspect to it. Okay, and particularly if you're able to travel to kind of embrace the sort of cosmopolitan identity, but that very nature of the fluid identity construct often kind of elides the fact that these are issues of great pain. Nobody wants to be displaced in this way, and whether you're rich or poor, or whether you're sort of whether you say you're a migrant or a refugee, or you are globetrotting, there's a level of disjuncture and things that you can't control in a way that is a source of anguish, so that one can't in today's world say borders are irrelevant, or we've outgrown it, we're beyond the nation, because the nation is there, and it's a sense of pain, not necessarily liberation in the way we like to characterize it.
Right, absolutely. Do you see the question on your screen, or would you like me to read it out, Zehra?
Can you read it out?
Okay, let me just read it out to you. Surela asked, you showed us images of textile factories in Mumbai and the steel factory at Talbot. What is the link between art and the industrialism that you portrayed through the images? Can you please elucidate the idea behind this connection?
Yeah, so I mean, that was one I didn't really go into that much here, because there's a little exhibition that I co-curated. It was actually very much a joint project at Glen Vivian, where we just used their collection. And then from that, there was a website created with Janvi Falke, and what we ended up doing was a series of talks and really drawing that sort of link. My talk for that made comparisons between Sudhir Patwardhan's paintings of Lower Parel and a sort of disappearing Bombay, and compared it with the Welsh very figurative paintings, some of them very dark, and some of them very disjunctured, like someone called Jack Crabtree. And I show these images and juxtapose them. And Jack Crabtree's work is actually, I think, called Save This Pit. And it's got many entry points. And it's actually talking about Thatcher, right? And just as in the 80s, you had the textile mill strikes that ended up meaning that those textile mills were shut, and that whole area then in Lower Parel is sort of now converted to flats and luxury shopping centers. And in a way, that strike became used as an excuse for that. A similar thing happens with the strikes, with the sort of coal miner strikes that stretch across Britain, but particularly of anguish to Wales. And so Save This Pit is about all of these sort of defunct industries that are dying anyway, one could arguably say. But then, Thatcher's regulations kind of kill off the last vestiges. So the only thing, ironically, that really remains is that steel factory. It's the steelworks, and today it's owned by Tata. So they're major players in this region, and I don't even know what a big deal it is for Tata. I doubt it. I think it's one of their many, and probably not a very profitable one either. But it's a question of great anxiety, because all of Port Talbot depends. There is only the steel factory, the steel works.
Right. Dr. Podar, do you want to come in, Dr. Podar? Okay, Daniel, please go ahead.
Hi. Can you see me? No, sorry.
No. So Daniel is one of the lovely artists from Wales.
Sorry you can't see me. I just wanted to, it's more of a comment really. I was really taken by this title, Diasporic Dreaming, and you talked about collective identity, but I was also thinking about Powys Castle in relation to personal identity and its importance as a place, as an origin story for Anglo-Indian individuals, and that importance, and actually the connection between the past and dreaming. So when I think about when I think about Afrofuturism work, I think very much about they've explored the past and the histories of slavery so significantly to be able to use that as a way to dream and imagine the future. And this is why I think this Powys Castle work is so important, because it gives this origin to be able to think and reimagine futures and dream differently. And so the work is incredibly, I think, important for Anglo-Indian artists and that site, to understand that site and what it represents. So it's more of an observation.
Yeah, and hopefully you'll be doing things for the show with Powys. But yeah, we don't know how that will actually work. But yeah, I mean, Taoist is a super contentious site in a way. Also, like, you know, it's I think, Daniel, is still a National Trust site. And that in itself is quite interesting because it's within the borders of Wales, right? So a National Trust is sort of an overarching body. Scotland doesn't have National Trust in the same way. So it's just England, Wales, and I think certain parts of Cornwall and Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, that count as for National Trust properties. And the dialogue of you know, Welsh heritage usually comes under a different branch, which is Cadw. And so if you just do a simple compare contrast with a National Trust property and how they kind of present their wall text versus Cadw, Cadw invariably tends to be super anti-English, you know, so they really are representing the English as the oppressor, as, you know, taking Welsh legends and sort of converting it into a sort of pan-English identity that becomes pan-British. So even as a space, Powys is interesting because it's a National Trust property. And then the question of like all of these things that are now being said about, you know, perhaps the Tipu works should be going back, but where would they go back to? You know, should we allow rich Arabs to buy them? At the same time, are they part of British heritage? Whose heritage? And while all of this is happening, the reality is that, you know, for the last few years, because of COVID, but even before that, it was difficult to access the work. It's very difficult to get there. But it's even when you get there, there's no there's no guarantee that even the lights will be on properly so that you can see anything. So, you know, it's one thing to talk about this is very important for British heritage, some of the most important works, you know, got from India sitting there. But at the same time, how is that heritage actually being even acknowledged? Or is there so much guilt around it that it's better to turn the lights off and not deal with it? In which case, would it be better elsewhere? But where elsewhere?
Yeah, these are very, very, very difficult issues. I mean, I don't think, I mean, when you're talking about restitution and, you know, elsewhere, I mean, even the fact that Henrietta buys a lot of the stuff after the Anglo-Mysore Wars. But, you know, it's like, so she buys it from somebody she's defeated. I mean, it's like a distress sale, if it's a sale at all.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly. And yet, I mean, there are some lovely art historians who you know really well, who gets really upset. She was so upset with me. She said, how can you say that, you know, she went on a shopping spree? You know, she paid for it.
But she did. Of course she did. Of course she did. Oh, why not? I mean, why not? What's the big deal that she's not the only one who did it? Lots of them who did it, and there are lots of. I mean, it's like saying all the robber barons of America. How did they acquire? Wasn't that a kind of a shopping spree as well? Haven't the Japanese gone on a shopping spree as far as impressionist art is concerned? So that happens. It happens. I mean, that's history. So that's you know that. But I think coming back to restitution and you know, it's such a difficult subject, and I don't think there are no answers, and I think it'll all have to be case by case, and there can never be a law that governs it all. It's just not possible. And so you know, we have on another note, because of what the world of the museums is facing, we're actually doing a seminar, a 3-month seminar on the problematics of museums, where restitution is a part of it, but it's not just restitution. It's also identity. It's also indigeneity. It's all of that comes into it. You know, whose collection? I mean, we just read, for instance, in the papers here, that the Pitt Rivers at Oxford has a fantastic collection of Naga material. Nagaland, where they were collected, they were sent as specimens of exotic India. A lot of it were just Naga skeletons and Naga heads and Naga anatomy in that way. And so they are actually returning it. Now that can be, it's all coming back from Pitt Rivers. It was in the papers in India. And because it's a community that needs to be given their space once again. And that's really a political thing that's happening because of the huge amount of neglect that's happened in the last 70 years regarding the Northeast, and now they're suddenly being given their space, and Nagaland being one of the 7. They are, and so it is being read. They are sending it back. So, but that is a community involved. So it may happen even with African material, like, when there are communities involved and they want their thing. But who do you send back Tipu's tiger to?
Yeah. And who do you send the Kohinoor back to?
Exactly.
I mean that's the main one.
Exactly. But so all of this is going to it's a lot of debate and a lot of theorizing that's happening now in the field of academia about these very issues, but actual practicality. Even the Elgin marbles are not going back. So what are we talking about? Something as prominent as that, So the rest of it is, but there is, like the Naga, if the newspapers are to be believed, and if they are right, this is what they said. And it's the Pitt Rivers collection at Oxford. And it was sent to the Pitt Rivers because it's a university museum, so they could study it for anthropology and for the various other disciplines that they required before. So there are things, the restitution is happening, but the whole, it's such a
minefield. I mean, there's also the other thing, which, as I was saying, it at the Courtauld at some level, because it was a more international student base, and London also. I was less aware of the fact that elite British kids, even the ones who go to boarding school, especially the ones who go to public school, private school, they're not taught empire in school. And certainly when they are taught, the conversation that is happening in public in Britain today is all about slavery, which I'm not saying is not a terrible thing, that it needs to be addressed. But at the same time, it's like to say that, and within Bristol, you had the Colston Monument, which was taken down, statue, right? And you can, as part of my course, we go and visit it, and it's in a prone state, with half of its skirt missing, and there were even debates about how it should be prone so that it doesn't look like it's lying in state. So it's not completely, it doesn't have a fence around it, so it doesn't, so it can be assessed, but it's deliberately kept low, as it were. The graffiti is still on it so that it doesn't look like it's got some kind of state funeral or anything like this. But all of this is like, that's Colston, so everybody now knows Colston. But the first class where, and they signed up for something that obviously is purporting that it's talking mainly about South Asia, and not one of these kids could actually tell me who is Robert Clive.
Exactly.
Which means
what? I mean,
restitution debate is
it's a hot potato, and it's much better to be politically correct and not do it at all. Just forget about it.
Yeah. What is Surela saying? Something has popped up.
The whole idea of India being referred to as exotic, is it becoming a misnomer? Well, it was considered as that. It's no longer considered as that. So I don't know what she's asking. I don't understand this question. But you would.
So we are actually 15 minutes and more over time. Oops. And it's been no, don't worry about it, because it's been a wonderful discussion. And so we're looking at the complexities of first uncovering the history, excavating it, and then acknowledging it as true, and then of course restitution. So it's really and I think what artists do is actually present this to us in their work. We see it, we see the history, and it's one way of revealing it, if you like, in visual form. So it's been a wonderful discussion, Zehra, and I am really happy you did this for us. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone. A big thank you to everyone who attended. And yes, we hope to see large numbers of you, because clearly you're interested in contemporary art, on the 27th. When we discuss the Sharjah Biennial as well. Thank you, Zehra. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And all our participants are saying thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's been lovely. If only be to get a chance to like natter with Rashmi. It's been ages.
No, I think we appreciated the whole talk and the natter Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
Zehra.
everybody.
See you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that